who are here in person and those of you that are online as well. It's been a really rich conference so far. I learned a lot from the session this morning. One thing of which is leave the translation to somebody else, because I think I'm really bad at it. So it flies out of my head as soon as it comes in. So I'm going to have to leave that to somebody else from now on. We've got a great session ahead of us, and we're going to try to do it a little bit different format than what we did this morning. It's going to be more like what we did yesterday, where the papers are just going to be short 10 to 15 minute introductions to the three speakers' projects, and then most of it is going to be conversation. I will begin that conversation by trying to get the speakers to argue with one another. So we have some serious disagreements on the panel, which is wonderful, and I'm going to try to get them to fight with one another. There was somebody from DePaul Security who was here. I hope she comes back to kind of, just in case things get out of hand and people start throwing chairs. It'll be like the Jerry Springer show. But and try to invite as much as possible everybody who's here in the room to join in the conversation. So let me introduce the three speakers all at once, and then they will go in order, and then we'll open up the conversation. So our first speaker is going to be Mike Baxter, who is an old friend of mine and an old friend of DePaul and a lot of people that are here. He has a MDiv from Notre Dame and a PhD from Duke. Has taught at Regis University for many years in Denver, but now he's back at Notre Dame at the McGrath Institute, and he's working on things like connecting the Eucharist and Catholic social teaching, working with the Office of Life and Human Dignity on anti-racist theory and practice, and he's trying to help the church understand what it would mean to canonize Dorothy Day. He has experience with Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement. He has been the founder of two Catholic worker communities, one in Phoenix and one in South Bend. And that's actually how I met my wife, that she worked with Mike at the Phoenix Andre House. Steve Millies is our second speaker. He is professor of public theology and director of the Bernardine Center at Catholic Theological Union. And the Bernardine Center is trying to kind of continue the work of Cardinal Bernardine, who's much beloved here in Chicago, and bringing a moral voice to public problems. He describes sharing Pope Francis's view that our shared responsibility for each other in the world is kind of where we need to begin with that. Before he came to CTU, he was and I'm not making this up, the Strom Thurmond Endowed Chair in Political Science at the University of South Carolina. So yeah, I think it's a step up to go from Strom Thurmond to Bernardine. So just having an endowed chair is a great honor, but you don't get to choose who you're named after anyway. So he is the author of many books and articles. His first book, Joseph Bernardine, Seeking Common Ground, won first place in the biography category in the Catholic Press Association's Book Awards, and you can read about some of his other publications and public media work in the biographical page that you've got. And then Toussaint Kafarhire Murhula is a Jesuit priest. He is at the Arupe Center for Research and Formation in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He is a theologian and a political science professor. and has lectured at various institutions worldwide, the Hekima Institute in Kenya, the Episcopal Theological College in Hungary, Sophia University in Japan, and the list goes on and on. He has a PhD in global politics and international relations from our neighbor to the north here, Loyola University. And so Toussaint knows Chicago well. Welcome back. And also has degrees in ethics and social theory and BAs in both philosophy and theology. And his research interests include what he's going to be talking on today, international relations and global politics. And you can read more about his accomplishments on the biographical page as well. So let's, Mike, if you would get us started.
Wish me luck. I was urged by Bill Cavanaugh to do a PowerPoint. This is my second ever. And I feel like I'm now up to date with a 20-year-old technology. My talk is on Americanism, the task I was assigned, and between the two Pope Leos. That was slide one. Look at this, it works. So there's 5 parts of my talk: Misguided Movement, Erroneous Doctrine, Phantom Heresy, Tragic Tradition. Mark LeBeau commented, this seems like a rather depressing talk, so I added a 5th part on after Americanism. And but basically I'll be telling a story of this Americanist tradition and how Leo the 13th fits into that, and how maybe Leo the 14th could break from it. We'll have to talk about whether that's possible. So part 1 is the Misguided Movement, which really started in the 19th century with 2 major figures, Orestes Bronson, who lived from 1803 to 1876, and was regarded as the most important Catholic intellectual in the 19th century. He ran his own journal for decades, kind of like a Substack of his day, called the Bronson Quarterly Review. He converted from Protestantism and saw a fundamental harmony between Catholicism and America. His key Americanist claim was that the founders, the U.S. founders, were working unwittingly under the sway of Catholic political thought and ideas, like the separation of powers and the consent of the governed. And this allowed Bronson to observe that the founders, is the phrase he uses, built better than they knew. That is to say, they were under the sway of Catholic ideas and didn't even know it. The second figure is Isaac Hecker, who was originally a Redemptorist priest, but he went off to start his own order, the Paulists. And it was designed to evangelize America and convert it to Catholicism as a whole. And he saw America as an opportunity for the Catholic Church to escape the rule of monarchs in Europe and to carry out the Church's mission within a new ethos of freedom and democracy and the spirit of the age. And so he found a providential fit between Catholicism and America. That's the phrase he uses. America is a providential nation. God brought it to humanity. In the late 19th century, 3 clerics took these ideas and turned it into a movement that was both national and international. And the 3 clerics, all Irish, not a coincidence, was John Ireland, the Archbishop of St. Paul, Minnesota, Archbishop John Kane of Dubuque, but was also a rector of the North American College in Rome, and later Bishop of Richmond. Dennis O'Connell was the one who worked in Rome and was later the Bishop of Richmond. These people, these 3, were influenced by Bronson and especially Hecker's ideas, and they saw America as the nation of the future, and the church in America as the church of the future, one that values democracy, individual freedom, active life, and other traits of the modern, or the spirit of the modern age. And this Americanist movement gained steam and urgency in the years after the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore in 1884, which took up the issue of how to absorb and serve the needs of the burgeoning immigrant church in the United States. And they wanted to encourage immigrants to adapt to their new home. And in adopting this posture, they were also joined by the de facto head of the Catholic Church, who was James Cardinal Gibbons, Archbishop of Baltimore. After the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore in 1884, a bunch of issues came to the fore, and I don't want to get into the details of them, but there was the school question, whether or not that Catholic schools should take federal funding. There was the German question, whether or not national German parishes would be allowed. There was starting the Catholic University of America, which at the time was seen as a modern enterprise, educational enterprise. And there was the World Parliament of Religions in 1893, whether or not they should participate. And it occurred right here in Chicago. And the temperance question was an issue as well. But the Americanist movement was also an international movement when these three Americanists, Ireland and Keane and O'Connell, wanted to bring these ideas to Europe as well. And they wanted to encourage the progressivist Catholic movements in Italy, Germany, and especially France. And it was at this point that Pope Leo was concerned and intervened, Pope Leo XIII, and declared it an erroneous doctrine. Pope Leo, I want to suggest, was he was not Pius IX. He was a little more flexible than Pius IX, but he was also no progressive. If you look at his encyclicals, Libertas in 1878, the subtitle is On the Evils of Modern Society. Attorney Patras sought to bring back Thomistic studies. Immortali Dei declared the union of church and state as the norm in Catholic teaching. We have Rerum Novarum, and we have these two other encyclicals that emphasize the importance of the rosary and the devotion to the Sacred Heart. So it's not exactly what we would call a liberal or progressive stance that Pope Leo took. In 1899, he wrote a short apostolic letter called Testem Benevolentiae. And the key focus, scholars will be happy to hear this, the key focus was a book. People were reading books back then, and the book was The Life of Isaac Hecker by Walter Elliott, who was a Paulist. And it had an introduction by Felix Klein, who was an Americanist in France. And the introduction celebrated Hecker's vision, and the key error that Leo XIII identifies is that liberty should be allowed in the church, as in secular states, in order to win converts to Catholicism. That's the error that Leo XIII identifies. And the point that he makes is that the church can never relax or omit part of her teaching because doctrinal truth is always and everywhere the same. But in making his point, he had a concession. He said that you can be, while you have to maintain firm Catholic doctrine, you can also practice and adapt to American politics and culture, so that the Americanist condemnation in 1899 affirms a split between doctrine on the one hand and politics and cultural life on the other hand. And it's this split that develops into what you could call the Americanist tradition. Mainly, what I want to say in this third part is that the Americanist tradition sets aside the Americanist controversy and focuses instead on the agenda of bringing Catholic social teaching to America. And the main figure here in the 1920s, 1919, we could say, was John Ryan, who was a student and a professor at Catholic University. He was head of the Social Action Department of the National Catholic Welfare Conference. He was the founder, I think, in effect, of the discipline of Catholic social ethics in the United States. And he takes up the legacy of Leo in Rerum Novarum without any reference to Leo's condemnation of Americanism. He was followed by John Courtney Murray, who is another key figure in the next generation. And Murray was a Jesuit priest, a teacher at Woodstock Theological Seminary. He was the editor of Theological Studies and of America. And he argued that the traditional Leonine doctrine, when it comes to politics, the union of church and state, might have been fine in the 19th century, but not in the 20th century and not in the future. What he wants to argue is that the United States, with its separation of church and state in the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, that clause in the Constitution had providential significance. And without delving into the argument, at least for now, Murray was a remarkable figure. He was at first instructed not to continue to publish in 1955 on issues of church and state because they started to contradict church teaching. But then with Pope John the 23rd, the restriction was lifted, and he published a few years later his most famous book, We Hold These Truths. That was the same year that Kennedy was elected president. In fact, he was on the cover of Time magazine in December of that year, right after the Kennedy election. And in the book, he uses Brownson's theme of the founders building better than they knew, and also uses the notion of a providential nation. And he had a hand in writing Dignitatis Humanae, the Council's Declaration of Religious Freedom, in 1965. And Murray's story, really, for a whole generation of Catholics of that time, was a coming-of-age story. The Catholic Church in the United States comes of age in the 60s. It moves out of its subculture into the mainstream. And a key element in this story is that the Americanist heresy was really not a much of an issue at all. It had nothing really to do with America. So we have this notion of America, the Americanist controversy, as a phantom heresy. And the histories in the United States tend to affirm this idea. Felix Klein, in 1943, wrote a book called Americanism, a Phantom Heresy. He was the one who wrote the introduction to Hecker's biography back in 1897. And then key American historians since then, they're all Irish. They're all men. Thomas McAvoy, John Tracy Ellis, Jay Dolan, David O'Brien, John McGreevy, they all tell the story of how America and Catholicism reach a certain harmony, although they have different emphases, especially McGreevy's is a little different than the others, a little less optimistic. They basically tell a comedy. You have these two unlikely parties who are destined, who want to get married, but they can't, but they overcome insuperable odds, and it concludes with a kind of wedding, 1965. But I want to suggest that this tradition turns tragic rather quickly, because right around the time that Catholicism supposedly comes of age, Catholics themselves end up dividing politically between, I suppose we could say, liberal or democratic and conservative or Republican. And they divide over a number of issues that I've listed here: racism, the Vietnam War, nuclear war, poverty, abortion, euthanasia, marriage, war on terror, Iraq war, economy, and so on and so forth. And we can see this reflected in all these elections, because in most every election since 1968, Catholics have roughly split between liberal and conservative. And these are the debates that we have become very familiar with, and I would want to say we live within this tragic tradition, so that we have liberal Catholics on the one hand and conservative Catholics on the other. I see Michael Sean Winters here and James Martin are on the left side. I see George Weigel and Father Mike Schmidt on the right side. We have divided publications like two NCRs, America and First Things. We even have divided prelates, Cardinal Bernardine, Cardinal Supich, Bishop Barron, and Bishop George, or Cardinal George, and they're all from Chicago. The one thing that unites them. And we even have, you could say, liberal and conservative popes, according to this view. You have John the 23rd and Francis on the one hand, and then we have John Paul II and Benedict the 16th on the other. And we could go on and identify liberal and conservative colleges and universities and so on. And what I want to say about this division is that Catholics, when they supposedly came of age, didn't begin to transform America. Actually, they transformed themselves into Americans. As they come of age, in other words, they get absorbed into U.S. political culture and they get divided, or better yet, they divide themselves accordingly. Leo's flaw, I want to suggest, in Testem Benevolentiae is that you can't confine religion and politics to separate spheres. And so now we're locked into a kind of reinforcing dynamic of partisan political polarization between liberal progressive Catholics and conservative ratty Catholics. And the only way out, I want to suggest, is that we need to unthink the necessity of the state in accomplishing justice in the world. Because I see this as a way that Catholics have been co-opted into the dynamics of state dominance of, you could say, our mission. And the way to do this is to locate ourselves in a different story or a different drama, and it being the Catholic Worker Anniversary, I want to suggest that the Catholic Worker provides a clue as to how to do this. Peter Morin said, we need parish homes, not parish domes. In other words, the Catholic Church should embody its own mission to the world. And Dorothy Day, who was never one to mince words when she thought it was necessary, said in 1948, she wrote, we are un-American, we are Catholic. Or in other words, for her, the only solution is love in the form of direct action, forming communities, houses of hospitality, shelters, farms, and so on. Resistance communities, I say this the day after the 10th anniversary that Dan Berman died. And that this kind of offers us another way of thinking about Catholic social ethics, what I could call the primacy of charity in Catholic social ethics, based on the liturgy, the sacraments, the saints, and direct service. And here I think we can retrieve Leo's devotional aspect, after 1891, in 1892, he wrote an encyclical called Laetitia Sanctae, but it's also called The Rosary and the Social Question. And in 1899, he wanted to consecrate all humanity to the Sacred Heart. And I think these could be read in line with other themes that come up in later encyclicals, John Paul II's Ecclesia America, Benedict XVI's Deus Caritas Est, and then two encyclicals we also already mentioned by Francis and Leo XIV. So what I want to say is, between the two Pope Leos, Catholics have been under the spell of Americanism, and both the liberal and the conservative Catholic standpoints have become implausible, if not, you could say, farcical. And that Catholicism in a post-Americanist mode would be both traditional in doctrine and devotion, politically non-aligned, devoted to personal service, so that the Church could retrieve its view of being a light to the nations, or better yet, a healing balm to the nations.
All right, thank you, Mike. There's a group of people that have been meeting in front of the ICE facility in Broadview and saying the Rosary every Friday morning for the last 20 years. I think Pope Leo XIII might be happy with that. Please, let's welcome Steve Millies to the podium.
You expect me to fight with that? That was tremendous. Good afternoon, my friends. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I want to begin with thanks to Bill, despite his expectations that fisticuffs are going to ensue later on here. I'm really delighted to be here. DePaul is such an important partner for Catholic Theological Union. We're very grateful always to DePaul, and I'm very glad to be here. I also know, as director of the Bernardine Center, we put on events like this too. And it is one thing to be the director, and that is hard, but to run the Zoom and to make sure the food shows up on time and to make sure everything goes well. So I thank the staff, Karen and Marlon and everyone else who put all of this together. I didn't expect to begin this way, but I feel also called upon just to say, as the former holder of the Strom Thurmond Endowed Chair in Political Science, I've been introduced that way in situations where it was frankly embarrassing, and I have occasionally thought about deleting it from my biography. The only thing that really keeps it there is exactly what happened here. I think back fondly about a time I was introduced to a much larger crowd in Vancouver, British Columbia, that could not recover from laughing after they heard me introduced that way in a different country on the other side of the continent. So, in the spirit of enjoying the big laugh, here I am, embodying both Joseph Bernardine and Strom Thurmond, the two most important South Carolinians produced in the 20th century, for better and for worse. In the name of keeping to 10 minutes, I've taken for granted here that the consistent ethic is generally understood, and also that the controversy that overtook the ethic in Cardinal Bernardine's lifetime and after is known. I describe both of these in my paper. I can talk later about them, but I omit them here to focus more on the development of the consistent ethic of life. Since Cardinal Bernardine, though, or rather the development of the consistent ethic of life since Cardinal Bernardine's death, though still I begin by reminding us that the consistent ethic of life gained national and international awareness in 1983, when Chicago's Cardinal Joseph Bernardine proposed it in the course of his Gannon lecture at Fordham University. At Fordham, Bernardine observed that when one carries a consistent ethic of life into the public debate today, one meets significant opposition from very different places in the political and ideological spectrum. Some see clearly the application of the principle to abortion, but contend the bishops overstep their bounds when they apply it to choices about national security. Others understand the power of the principle in the strategic debate, but find its application on abortion a violation of the realm of private choice. I contend, Cardinal Bernardine concludes, the viability of the principle depends on the consistency of its application. And here I think I make an almost seamless transition from how Mike ended. The consistent ethic is here to confound that instinctive division that we have absorbed a little too easily as Catholics in American public life. But the ambition that Bernardine named in his Fordham Address's subtitle was even greater and points in that direction Mike pointed us toward. An American Catholic Dialogue was his subtitle. Bernardine intended to offer the consistent ethic not just to the Catholic community, but as a moral vision for the whole community. And he said, the substance of a Catholic position on a consistent ethic of life is rooted in a religious vision, but the citizenry of the United States is radically pluralistic in moral and religious convictions. So we face the challenge of stating our case, which is shaped in terms of our faith and our religious convictions, in non-religious terms, which others of different faith convictions might find morally persuasive. Eventually, no less than John Rawls would agree that Bernardine had been successful in this way. The consistent ethic of life satisfied even Rawls's own standards for publicly reasonable argument. Over time, since Cardinal Bernardine died in 1996, the consistent ethic has developed. In Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis's encyclical on social friendship or solidarity, he picked up some of Cardinal Bernardine's themes by pointing us beyond consistency, not just consistency alone. Pope Francis wrote that when individuals or groups are consistent in their thinking, defend their values and convictions, and develop their arguments, this truly benefits society. Yet this can only occur to the extent that there is genuine dialogue and openness to others. Moral consistency is connected to our shared identity as a community and a church by Pope Francis. An attractiveness of consistency arises from being able to speak to one another about how much we share fundamental values, which include human dignity, but also the goodness of the community itself. But consistency without dialogue, without love, is a sterile and fruitless thing. Tenderness and a shared feeling of responsibility for one another, what we might call solidarity, those are the wellspring from which a consistent ethic of life emerges, as much as also emerges the topic of Fratelli's 5th chapter, a better kind of politics. But what must come first is openness. We can describe an ethic or call one another to be committed to community and one another all the day long, but it's openness that makes those things possible. And openness is cultivated in our lives of prayer and worship. Openness is a signal that our conversion to the gospel is ongoing and growing and deepening. This notion of solidarity was in the air before Fratelli was released in 2020. Chicago's Cardinal Blaise Cupich gave remarks at Loyola University Chicago, where he was invited by my good friend Mike Murphy, who's right here, gave remarks at Loyola University Chicago in 2017 under the title, Witnessing to a Consistent Ethic of Solidarity, where Cardinal Cupich updated the consistent ethic to link it with solidarity. Cardinal Cupich quoted Pope Francis, as Emil Sakuda quoted him yesterday. Cardinal Cupich quoted Pope Francis, who reminds us that realities are greater than ideas. And this reframing of the consistent ethic reflects something like that. A consistent ethic of solidarity doesn't ask us what is the most correct thing we can think of doing in an abstract way. It asks us, what good can I do concretely here, where I am now? The consistent ethic isn't the answer to an intellectual problem. It's a call to conversion. These developments of the consistent ethic of life, remarkable and unlikely as they were after it had become so controversial, converge around a new vision for a consistent ethic and only point toward the most unlikely and remarkable development of all, when, in November 2023, at the Universidad Católica Santo Toribio, the former Bishop of Chiclayo and future Bishop of Rome gave remarks upon receiving an honorary degree. In those remarks, he drew a line of connection between the discourses and insights of 3 cardinals, he said, all from Chicago. Cardinal Joseph Bernardine, who was Archbishop of Chicago in the 1990s, Cardinal Blaise Cupich, who's currently the Archbishop, and myself, as you know, born in Chicago. In those remarks, Cardinal Prevost gestured back to Cardinal Bernardine's Gannon lecture and to Cardinal Cupich's Loyola remarks, saying that, quote, Cardinal Cupich has recently suggested reclaiming and further developing the concept of the consistent ethic of life, expanding it into what he calls a new integral ethic of solidarity. By embracing this proposal, Cardinal Prevost went on, the Church can offer a precious gift to the people of God, and indeed to all who seek the common good. If the Church takes seriously Pope Francis's call to embody a synodal church, we must instill an integral ethic of solidarity into every dimension of our lives. That was all Cardinal Prevost. And here, he connects all of the elements. This is an inclusive vision of solidarity, with a message containing a moral vision for the whole church and the whole world. This is an invitation to openness, an openness that must be nurtured in openness. This is a spirituality of life. For all these reasons, as Pope Leo XIV has made remarkable public statements since weighing in to support Illinois Senator Dick Durbin in September, or down to his recent remarks about the Iran war and the death penalty, we can have little doubt. There is new life today for this consistent ethic. But what can it mean to say there's new life for a consistent ethic in the Pope Leo era? In 2022 remarks at Catholic Theological Union, joining Fratelli Tutti to a consistent ethic of life, the prefect of the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, Cardinal Michael Czerny, concluded by saying this: if we accept the great principle that there are rights born of our inalienable human dignity, we can rise to the challenge of envisaging a new humanity. We can aspire to a world that provides land, housing, and work, terra, techo, trabajo, for all. This is the true path of peace, not the senseless and myopic strategy of sowing fear and mistrust in the face of outside threats. For a real and lasting peace will only be possible, quoting now Pope Francis, on the basis of a global ethic of solidarity and cooperation in the service of a future shaped by interdependence and shared responsibility in the whole human family. The dignity of persons is not abstract, and our action to affirm that dignity cannot be remote from the persons whom we affirm. Land, housing, and work on May Day are concrete goods. They draw our eye to the horizon of our experience, not out beyond the horizon toward concepts and principles. My debt of justice to the other is always right here. Peace, as we say, begins with me. Peace is a call to conversion. And this is the ethic we are called to embrace. Only 1 year into the Leo XIV papacy, very few predictions seem prudent or even defensible. But one prediction seems incontrovertible. The social doctrine of Leo XIII animates his contemporary namesake. And the development of social doctrine will characterize the Leo XIV papacy. It must. The threats to the human person that cry out to the church for a moral vision and a concrete response are too pointed and proliferating too quickly. And like the attention he's paid to the treatment of migrants or the victims of war, Pope Leo has spoken several times about artificial intelligence. CWCIT has put the poor at the center and challenged the wealthy elite living in a bubble of comfort and luxury. Pope Leo is thinking in public about the dignity of the human person in the 21st century. It is impossible not to see it. Just as important, we should see that his thinking is conditioned not just by the origins of the consistent ethic of life in Cardinal Bernardine's writings, but in the development of the consistent ethic, the development it has gotten in the thinking of Cardinal Cupich and Cardinal Czerny and Pope Francis and others I would like to name too, but omit for time. Pope Leo has a current and up-to-date picture of a consistent ethic in his mind, which seems to be summed up nicely as a global ethic of solidarity that calls us all to deepening conversion, dialogue, encounter, and most of all to relationship with Jesus Christ, the one who expresses God's deepest love for human persons and God's closeness to our suffering and our vulnerability. The lines of convergence from Vatican II to Cardinal Bernardine to Cardinal Cupich to Pope Francis seem to converge in Pope Leo, just as lines that crisscross the globe, from Chicago to Chiclayo to Rome and back, tell the story of a global vision nurtured in a missionary's journey. We do not know all that this papacy will bring. We can't know that yet. But we can see direction and trajectory. And that line traces a consistent ethic that asserts the infinite value of even just one person. Even just one person is loved infinitely by an infinite God. Just one person is an image of God. Each person is an inexhaustible depth in the whole of reality. Pope Leo, that was rather Freudian, and it ruined my conclusion. But Pope Leo seems certain to call the world to that realization. Call us there with determination, with love, and with consistency. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Steve, for really helpfully reframing the consistent ethic of life into a consistent ethic of solidarity. And as you were talking, I couldn't help but think of the pictures that Toussaint showed us this morning, the kind of real on the boots, on the ground, boots on the ground kind of solidarity that Cardinal Prevost showed in Peru.
Well, good afternoon. I would like also to take a moment to say thank you very much, actually, for inviting me to join in this conversation. Bill and Stan, thank you so very much. Thank you also, Karen, and of course, and Marlon for the many emails and exchange to get me to Chicago and be a part of this moment. My presentation, as you can see, examines what can be considered Pope Leo XIV's first fully dedicated apostolic journey to Africa. I want to say that it situates this visit within a broader geopolitical and ethical context, a continent long marginalized in global policy priorities, yet increasingly central in renewed international interests, often driven less by the concern for its people than by competition for its natural resources. I believe recent development, including the rollback of humanitarian infrastructures, such as the USAID, and the expansion of extractive agreements, underscore the necessity for a moral assessment of Africa's role in the global order. My presentation, actually, I would like, maybe for the sake of time and to summarize myself, approach maybe 5 different points. The first one being Africa today as a defining moment. The second point being a moral question. The third one being a pontificate defined by Africa. The fourth one is the Catholic social teaching as a framework for theologizing today. And finally, the need for an ethical leadership on the African continent. So, Pope Leo XIV recently concluded his initial significant apostolic visit to Africa from April 13 to April 23rd. As a member of the Augustinian order, he held a deep appreciation for returning to Africa, embodying the principle of perfecta caritatis, which advocates a dual focus on visiting or revisiting origins and discerning the Holy Spirit's promptings or guidance, intertwining adaptation with the renewal of religious life. His spiritual foundation within the Augustinian community profoundly influenced his identity and motivated both his personal pilgrimage to Annaba in Hippo, in time of Augustine, and his broader apostolic mission of fostering connectivity, which he calls building bridges, as he articulated during his flight to Algeria. I quote, having the opportunity to visit the places associated with the life of St. Augustine, where he served as bishop of the city of Hippo, now known as Annaba, is truly a personal blessing for me. I believe it is also a blessing for the church and the world, because we must always seek bridges to build peace and reconciliation. And he continues saying, this journey then truly represents a valuable opportunity to continue with the same voice and message that we wish to convey to promote peace, reconciliation, respect, and consideration for all people. So this was an interview he gave on the flight on Monday, 13th of April, while flying to Algeria. I believe before the trip, it was natural to ask what the African Church could expect from this pontificate. What could expect from this pontificate and from the Universal Church. Afterward, especially in light of Father Stanchu's description of Pope Leo's epiphany in one of his interviews on CNN, I believe it is fair to reverse the question. What can and should the Universal Church expect from Africa? I remember we had some good conversation yesterday talking about, the place that the church in Africa can play and all the politics of having maybe an African Pope. Last year, the African Network of Theologians, exactly 1 year today, I think, we were gathering and we were discussing about the possibility of having an African Pope. And I remember in one of my remarks, I was telling people that maybe that should not be the point. Although I have been serving in many spaces and forums as an Africanist, I didn't think, or I don't think even today, that having a Pope with a skin color of Africa is what the church really needs. We need to be listening to the promptings of the Holy Spirit. And I was telling a colleague here that sometimes you can have an African Pope who is more Papist, more Roman, than Italians themselves. So, starting his tour in Africa, a region affected by global forces and injustices, Pope Leo XIV has already revealed his focus, emphasizing Catholic social teaching, human dignity, justice and peace, and ethics. His trips aimed to find, accompany, and understand the people of God, as he put it, and to proclaim the gospel and support their faith, but also experience their joys and suffering. Archbishop José Betancourt highlighted this prophetic boldness in advocating for the vulnerable amid global challenges, echoing his predecessor's themes that revolve around what I just mentioned, natural resources management, justice and peace, and the condemnation, of course, of political and social corruption. In short, to close this point, I would say that Pope Leo's decision to inaugurate his pontificate with an apostolic journey to Africa signals a decisive theological shift. The continent is no longer framed merely as a recipient of charity, someone was saying this morning, but as a locus theologicus, a privileged site for theological reflection. By centering Africa's lived realities, marked by resilience, suffering, joy and faith, and communal vitality, the Pope elevates its experience as sources of insight into Universal Church's mission. This move challenges Eurocentric theological paradigms and affirms that the future of Catholicism will increasingly be shaped by voices and experiences from the global South, where faith is dynamically embodied amid complex social and ethical challenges. My second point is a moral question. Pope Leo XIV highlights a moral question. Do our systems respect human dignity or treat people as disposable? Do they promote justice or deepen exclusion? Do they embody responsibility or perpetuate exploitation? I believe these issues are evident where extractive economies, weak institutions, and inequalities intersect. Africa therefore provides a lens to assess globalization's moral integrity, but also the Church's universal mission. My next point, the third point, I want to look at a pontificate framed by Africa. Here is a brief recap of Pope Leo's visit to Africa. Over 11 days, amid global conflicts over resources and wars, the Pope views Africa as a teacher and an opportunity to promote peace, reconciliation, respect, and consideration. I believe three pillars of the Catholic social teaching emerge. They have been mentioned throughout our conference. The sacredness of every human life, or the sacred dignity of every person, justice for sustainable peace, and a call for moral and ethical responsibility among the leaders and the Christians to drive social change. In his addresses in Algeria, Cameroon, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, Pope Leo offered a theological framework to counteract resurgent extractivism linked to development, ecological harm, and governance crisis. These issues threaten democracy. They threaten the spirit of immigrant hospitality. They threaten the promotion of peace in war-torn regions of the world and support dictatorial policies that demand loyalty over freedom. His focus on Africa therefore emphasizes the continent's role as a proactive agent capable of leading global effort in justice, reconciliation, and ecological responsibility. Very quickly, in Algeria, the Pope visited Annaba to reconnect with his Augustinian roots, as I mentioned, and highlighted Africa's cultural history at a crossroad of epochs and geographies. The Pope emphasized that true peace is not just the absence of conflict, but an expression of justice and dignity, possible only through forgiveness. Acknowledging Algeria's painful yet resilient past, the Pope urged avoiding resentment cycles and fostering inner peace to spread the gospel across political, cultural, and spiritual divisions. The Pope also honored those who fought for independence and the martyred Trappists, monks, and the Augustinian nuns. Remember the movie of God's Men that was made out of the lives and discernment of these Trappist monks. The Pope stressed that peace is more than conflict-free living. It is justice and dignity, aligning with Pope Francis' message that all are brothers and sisters, fratelli tutti, and that the future belongs to peaceful, just people. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons and daughters of God. In Cameroon, Pope Leo XIV offered a powerful moral appeal for responsible governance. His frankness, his address to authorities, civil society, and the diplomatic corps surprised many. I remember actually as colleagues here were pushing me to send maybe my notes, I said there isn't much I can share before I really listen and hear what Pope Leo had to deliver within the African continent. And the boldness of Pope Leo was just straightforward to see how he would talk or speak to African leaders. As someone yesterday was saying that the church has been asleep. I think the church in Africa, I don't think it is really asleep, because I know that many of our conferences of Catholic bishops in our countries are maybe one of the most vocal and powerful on the continent. So Cameroonian leaders should prioritize human dignity, justice, and the common good, fighting corruption, inequality, and undue influence. His focus on equitable distribution highlights the universal destination of goods. Reflecting St. Augustine, he acknowledged social tensions like the Anglophone conflict, calling for reconciliation and dialogue. To resolve these issues, Pope Leo stressed respecting the rule of law, strengthening institutions, and exercising authority as service and not as domination. So shifting the understanding or the perception of leadership. In Angola, Pope Leo conveyed a message of hope, resilience, and social responsibility. Drawing inspiration from the gospel account of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, he gently reminded us that prolonged suffering can sometimes lead to feelings of despair and stagnation. However, he also articulated that faith serves as a foundation for becoming protagonists of a new humanity and a new society. In Equatorial Guinea, Pope Leo XIV calls for rejecting exclusion, upholding human dignity, and focusing development efforts on the common good rather than on power or profit. He really emphasized that the genuine development must be anchored in justice, responsibility, and solidarity. I will pass the details for the sake of time, and I will move maybe to the Catholic social teaching framework. I propose that the Catholic social teaching offers an alternative framework that structures the Catholic vision of relations among humans, among nations, creation, and God. Moving from a Hobbesian way of looking at humanity as a self-interested and conflictual to a Christian anthropology grounded in the inherent dignity of every person created in the image and likeness of God. So this is a foundational principle of the Catholic social teaching. Moving also beyond blame for historical injustices toward an active ethical responsibility in addressing the present realities. So we called actually to look, to interpret the present through the lenses of the Catholic social doctrine. And finally, the third option that I am taking from the Catholic social teaching is orienting all transformation toward a holistic vision of justice that integrates social and political and economic concerns as the ultimate goal. I will skip most of this because I've seen Bill standing up to remind me that it is time. And I will turn to my short conclusion for the time being because I know we shall be having this conversation to be continued. So I would say that Pope Leo XIV's African journey presents a heartfelt challenge to the Church, but also to Africa as a whole. We are called to act with a sense of responsibility to take up the agency that is expected from us and to know that there will be no change that will happen unless we agree to become actors of our own historical situation. So in his final reflection, I believe Pope Leo XIV emphasized that Africa has offered him an immeasurable treasure of faith, hope, and charity, affirming its vital role in renewing the Church's mission and the Church's spiritual vitality. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Toussaint, for that excellent presentation where you've reminded us that Pope Leo didn't just go to Africa to bring hope, but sees Africa as a source of hope. And a lot of what he was saying has already been said by the bishops, especially in the DRC for a long time. So if I could have the three panelists then come forward, I promised that I would try to get them to disagree with one another. And so I am going to start out by asking one question for each panelist to react to something in another one's paper. And I'm just going to lay the three questions out there and then let you take it from there. But Steve, I wanted to ask if you would respond to Mike's presentation of Leo XIII. Both of you presented Leo XIV as a worthy successor of Leo XIII. Mike presented Leo XIII as kind of a conservative, and you presented Leo XIII as progressive. And so I wonder if you want to push back on that presentation, Mike's presentation of Leo XIII as not a progressive. Mike, if you would, in the longer version of Steve's paper, he refers to Cardinal Bernardine talking about how this vision for America comes out of our faith, our Catholic faith, but it needs to be translated into more neutral and secular language in order to be taken on by the wider society. And he quotes Rawls as actually, John Rawls, the American political philosopher, as pointing to this idea in Cardinal Bernardine as an exemplification of what he's talking about, kind of taking, translating Christian beliefs into more neutral language. And I wonder if you see that as a good thing or not, if that is a manifestation of what you would call Americanism, this kind of too much assimilation to American society. And Toussaint, in Mike's paper, he quotes, the exact quote is, the necessity of unthinking the necessity of the state. But you in your presentation talked about strengthening the state, about better, more regular application of justice and civil responsibility and the ending of corruption and so on. So I'm wondering if you would comment on that. You know, people like Emmanuel Katongole say, well, the state is, it's corrupt and it's designed to be that way in Africa. We need to, instead of just trying to pour more effort into the state, we need to pour more effort into alternatives to the state, like the church, the kind of ecclesial entrepreneurs that Afe was talking about yesterday. So I wonder if you would comment on that. So I'm putting those three things out there to start the conversation. So whoever wants to address that first, go ahead.
Bill, I'm going to begin by disappointing you. I really don't think Leo the 13th was a progressive. I teach Rerum Novarum, and for everything that we celebrate about Rerum Novarum, there's actually quite a lot in there, making sure that everyone is very clear that the church protects private property. And the wider corpus of Leo the 13th, is as fraught and as even conflicted as I think both Rerum Novarum and to some degree Testa Benevolentiae are. What I think I would say, though, is that very much like Leo the 13th, or very much like Leo the 14th, I would say, Leo the 13th was living in a very challenging economic and political and social transition as industrialization was getting underway and transforming everything about how we all live in the world. I give a lot of credit to someone like Leo the 13th, who was trying to figure out how to navigate that, and in a way that, and so maybe this is something progressive about him, in a way that I think no bishop of Rome had before, made an effort to address himself to what were in those times very current events, to really try to respond. There were a lot of historical reasons, of course, why he tried to do that, but it began a new trajectory for the papacy, not just to inaugurate modern Catholic social teaching, but also to make the church in an unusual way accountable to current events. That's certainly something I think that's quite different and worth talking about. I'd love to get in to the question that you have about letting go of the necessity of the state, but I will leave that for others.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, for the question about the necessity of unthinking the state. What I can say actually to begin is that looking at or listening to what Pope Leo has been saying lately about, let's say, the issue of immigration, it looks like the Pope himself does not reject the possibility of rethinking the state as an institution within which human beings can organize their lives and live decently. He does not question the fact that we do have borders, even if we have to contextualize, to historicize, I would say, these borders. And someone like Emmanuel Katongole, when he looks at, let's say, the states in Africa and say that they are inherently corrupt, there is a point, but I think the diagnosis might be missing the fact that the trajectory of the African state is really the fact that they carry within their DNA the very colonial role to play. And so most of our states, and we're discussing this morning, are somehow crafted to respond to the needs that come from outside, because as we see also, there is a kind of divide between those who are in charge of the state within the African continent and the community they are supposed to be serving. And so coming back to the principles that I am kind of exploring within, let's say, the conversation of today and my paper is simply to show that instead of having the nature of leaders that we do have in Africa, Pope Leo is, and the boldness that I was referring to, is reminding that leadership is meant to be service within the framework or the context of the Catholic social teaching, rather than power and authority, as we've seen, so much so that our states are run from outside and our leaders are accountable much more outside the African continent than they are within the African continent. And so I believe actually it is an opportunity for many of us, church or scholars, people who are thinking or rethinking the post-colony within the African context, to show that this community, these arrangements, and someone mentioned even John Rawls, who reminds that all of these arrangements, political arrangements, the moment they do not serve the purpose of peace, of justice, of equity, I would say they need to be dismantled and reframed and remade, if you will. And so that's just to say that the church, the state in Africa might not be the problem. The problem might be really, the spirituality that we kind of, instill within these institutions. And that is the task of what we're doing.
So my question is, right?
Yeah. Just move it closer.
And I guess I want to say that what strikes me about Steve's story is that it tells half the story, the story from the liberal perspective. And what I think that dilemma that we've had since, let's say, something like that, since the 80s, not before, were identified well by Alistair McIntyre in his book After Virtue, when he said the great issues, war, or abortion, or economics, are unsettled and unsettlable. Like they really can't be settled at least on the terms that we tend to invoke in trying to debate these things in public discourse and public debate and so on. And I feel like one way that we get kind of co-opted into these unsettleable debates are invoking principles that are so malleable that they can go in either direction. Like even the principle which everyone is citing of human dignity can be invoked for both sides of the euthanasia debate, both sides of the abortion debate, and you could even say both sides of the nuclear debate in the 1980s, because people that wanted to maintain a posture of deterrence were trying to save humanity. It's kind of a human dignity purpose. But there were other people who wanted to call for unilateral disarmament. There are about a handful, about a dozen bishops who called for unilateral disarmament. But Steve's hero and a beloved cardinal, Bernardine, took that off the table in January of 1981 in these discussions. He said there will be no call in this pastoral letter for unilateral disarmament. Now, my own view is that they should have called for unilateral disarmament. So that I feel like if we take these debates on the terms that we are handed, by the kind of that is kind of free floating solidarity. If we take these principles, we're going to find ourselves in the same debates and in the same position now, or in 5 years, as we are now, and have been, I would say, for the last 50 years in one way or another. And I feel like we need to kind of back out. Like Peter Moore used to say, we took a wrong turn, we need to back out and get back on the right road. Anyway. Sorry about that. We'll get there.
Yeah, I don't necessarily want you to fight, but I do want. I would love to hear Steve and Toussaint your responses to that, and then we'll open it up for more questions.
Well, let me give this a whirl. I think in some ways Mike is raising maybe the wrong question. Because I don't think the goal of all of this, even from a point of view of Catholic social teaching, the goal of all of this is not to settle the contestability of the issues. The goal of all of this is not that we all should agree even about what human dignity means, although as Catholics that should be easy-ish. But I think rather it requires us to take a really large step back and ask what the purpose of politics, and for that matter, the state, is. And the purpose of all of this is to have an alternative to violence, because conflicts arise in the contestable social circumstances where we live. Politics is how we resolve those things without violence. And I agree with you very much, as I would in some ways agree with Peter Moore, and we've taken a big wrong turn. But I think the big wrong turn that we have taken is not one that arises from differences that are concerned with moral or ethical or economic or political questions. The big wrong step that we have taken is the state's not the problem here. The problem's partisanship. And the problem is our attachment to and our commitment to the inevitability of a traditionalist and progressive or liberal and conservative or democratic and Republican binary. That is, in fact, the trap that we're caught in. We're caught in the trap of only two choices. The state and politics itself are here to assert the possibility of the common good on behalf of everybody, at least in a best of all possible cases. What I think we have is something that has arisen in the difficult and tumultuous circumstances we find ourselves in together with Pope Leo today. The difficulty I think that we have is that much of that slide that you had that divides left from right up there, that's real, but it also arises from an industry that exists to get rich promoting it. And that's as true in politics as it is in the church. And it's a lie. And I think that's the problem. And I think the lie also discourages us from seeing the state as a solution. The state has its imperfections. Politics, the idea of a political community discerning together, that's going to have its imperfections because the contestability of fundamental issues that are important to us isn't going to go away. And in fact, it was that contestability in the wars of religion of the 17th century that brought us to this place in the first place, of trying to figure out how to have a modern constitutional state where believing different things about contestable things that are important to us can be settled without violence. I'm really intrigued, by the way, Toussaint, by the idea. I'm thinking a lot about how we're learning through theology the historical meaning of colonialism and decoloniality, and the necessity of thinking about states in Africa as something that has been imposed by the West. It's been imposed not just by Western political establishments, it's been imposed by Western money, right? What would contextualizing an African modern constitutional state look like? I think that's one of the things we're learning in the 21st century. So I think, I don't want to be too firm and too fixed about the role of politics in the state to say that it has to be the same everywhere. But I do want to say that the hope we have for the common good comes from those places. They're generally the only hope that ordinary people have against the enormous power of money that does so well by dividing us.
Anybody else want to comment before I open the floor up? Yeah. Good.
We should open it up, but before we do, what I want to say is that when you say something like the state has prevented us from violence, what do we do with narratives like Shannon tells about slavery? And is it true, which I tend to think, that racism, anti-black racism, is baked in to, what we call the institutions of the state? I don't know what you want to call it, but the way at least I want to take the story that Shannon told of black Catholics in, how do we describe this even, right? The New World, what are we going to call it? The nation, or like how do we tell that story in a faithful way without overturning the story? And I'd like to overturn the story of American freedom in 1776, 250 years ago. We're going to have it up to our eyeballs this year in how great this republic is. And I'd like to invoke other narratives to say it's been violent as hell. And that's the story I'd like to tell. That's why I like Greg's talk last night, because he tells a story about the two Americas, or America, from two different perspectives. And it's a hellish story for a lot of people. And I don't know, I would like to tell a counter narrative. That's, I guess, a way to put it. All right, anyway.
All right, Shannon.
No. I actually wanted to follow up on that, because I feel like we're also missing sort of, I want to sort of introduce the moment that we all find ourselves in now with the profound gutting of the Voting Rights Act by a Catholic-dominated Supreme Court. Sort of in many ways, sort of a resurrection of a Tawny Court, right? That where we were told by the nation's first Catholic Supreme Court justice that black people had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect. And now we've seen something designed specifically to gut what I argue to be the most humanist and the most progressive voting base that exists in the United States, and that is that of Black Southern voters. And I say that in part as the conversation was sort of geared towards thinking about how Pope Leo has spoken on issues of great concern, moral concern with us as it relates to war, the possibility of nuclear war, as it relates to the possibility of immigration and what that means, but also recognizing the profound silence that has come as it relates to the gutting of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And as we're talking about sort of a polarized America, liberal versus conservative, et cetera, my question is, if we were to include Black Catholics in that diagram, are they divided? And if the most humanist and most progressive voting base has just been gutted, which means everything now, whether it relates to immigration, war, falls because we have not addressed the problem of anti-Blackness and being baked into the state and being baked into our understanding of the American Catholic experience. What does that mean? Because I guess I just want to also broaden who we talk about when we say, who are the Catholics? Because if we're only talking about if we're only talking about priests, we're ignoring sort of the great power that elected officials have, those who are on the Supreme Court. It matters that it's a Catholic governor in Texas. It matters that it's a Catholic governor in Florida. It matters that it's a Catholic governor in Oklahoma. But I need to also say it matters that it is a white Catholic governor. Those are white Catholic governors or white passing governors in those spaces, white Catholic governors in those spaces. And so if we were to also sort of recognize then historically, if white Catholics have never been the moral compass of this nation based on our voting, based on the practices, how are we envisioning a future and a threat, and especially in conversations suggesting that Africa as a continent and African nation states are vulnerable, ignoring the ways in which the U.S. state is extremely vulnerable to falling to fascism, et cetera, and the role of the church in playing in that. I guess I just want to sort of figure out, how do we have a conversation that really sort of reflects, one, the great diversity of what it means to be Catholic and historically meant to be Catholic in the United States? How do we decenter sort of priests in our conversations about who has great power within the church, and also ignoring the role, ignoring the ways in which the Catholic Church has indeed shaped what it is meant to be American and shaped the policies and structures of white supremacy that threaten us in the contemporary period and also affect our foreign policies, and have historically sort of framed Africa as this sort of space in need of missionary work, when in fact it is far more complicated than that. That's a lot to say, but hopefully that can be reflected in some of the conversations, because I think we're just sort of missing the fact that if we need to say white Catholics, we need to be very honest about saying white Catholics. And we also need to be very cognizant about who's actually polarized in American society at this moment and what role the church has actually played in that polarization, if that makes sense. Thank you.
No, I guess, I've been wanting to talk to you about this since we met a couple months ago, but I think one of the reasons why we have less of an ecclesially grounded social ethic in the United States now, Catholics in the United States now, is precisely because of the failure of the church to overcome segregation when it could after World War II. And that was because, and so that Catholics who wanted to overcome segregation found opposition within the church, but they found support by the federal government. That's a problem for my argument, I acknowledge. But I want to say that the federal government, in starting to overcome segregation in little piecemeal ways with its policies on housing and transportation and so on, turned the reformers and the like activists who wanted to overcome racism to the state for the solution rather than the church. And what I want to say is that was a missed opportunity. That the church and the white clerics you're talking about failed us as Catholics. And it needs to be, I think, rewritten in some way to account for that. Anyway, I don't know.
I'm kind of tempted actually to de-Americanize your question. And in the 90s, the Rwandan genocide. When reflecting on that, there is a Cameroonian philosopher, former Jesuit, Fabien Busibulaga, who mentioned that Rwanda had become almost a metaphor for the rest of the African continent. That whatever happened in Rwanda could happen anywhere within the continent, within just like a spark of And the question that people have been raising was to say, how could that experience happen within a country that was maybe 90% Catholic? And so you begin to wonder, to really raise the question whether being a Catholic has to have a color, whether African American here or white, in Rwanda, whether a Tutsi or a Hutu, and in so many other parts of the world, whether being a Catholic can really help us transcend some of those cultural divisions or divides that, so how do we define our Catholicity, our belonging to the church? What is the boldness of, it is not specific to our time or to us, because I believe actually at the very beginning of the church itself, the Gentiles and the Jews were fighting over some of these, identity issues. But to be really Catholic, I think should give us maybe, the courage to go beyond that way of looking at, the dividing lines and be prophetic. And, I don't know. I just feel like it's a question that brings us back to think deeply about what it means to carry that heritage, but also how does it shape really the identity that we have in face of all the social issues that we are confronting or not.
I want to get on to another question, but I want to speak to all of this as quickly as I possibly can. I grew up around here, and I grew up on the south side. I grew up not far from where the Pope grew up. And there's a story that I know that our Pope must know, because no one who's from here could not know it, about when Martin Luther King came to Marquette Park. Parishioners from St. Justin Martyr Parish not only threw rocks and bottles at him, but there's a story that's a little less known, but we know it, that some of them also, the priests of the parish had encouraged the parish to go out and join the march in Marquette Park because the priests would be there, and they were there, and while they were there, their parishioners tried to light the rectory on fire to burn it down because the priests of the parish had aligned themselves with Dr. King. I'm thinking about this in the light of how we're using words like church. The church is the priest and its ecclesial leadership in the hierarchy, but it's actually those parishioners, right? That's what the theology of Lumen Gentium is here to tell us. The state is its institutions, but the state is also constituted by its citizens who interact with one another through politics to determine what it's going to do. At one point in this country's history, we were successful passing the Voting Rights Act. It wasn't easy, but we were successful doing that. That was an accomplishment of the people of the United States through their government, through the institutions of the state in order to do that. But also, if we don't take our citizenship seriously, if we don't take our Catholicity seriously, what I'm trying to say is that it really all redounds to us, and it redounds to that question of the interior movement and whether or not we are actually converted to what we are gathered to believe in, either as citizens or as members of the church.
we could go on for hours, I think, on the topics we've started to open up here. I just wanted to point to something which seems to me a very helpful part of a path forward, which it touches on Mike's discussion about the state and America, but it seems to me that the history of the modern Catholic social tradition really culminates in a way in the incarnational understanding of the apostolate of the laity articulated there. And there the mission is to inform all the temporal order in people's milieu or different spheres of influence with the gospel, Catholic social people. So, and that we didn't do. We didn't implement that. And it seems to me that part of the reason is the rise of the Catholic New Right and a lot of the work they did in collaboration with oligarchs and money networks to divert the church into a culture war model. And so my basic question is, isn't a recovery of that incarnational model of the apostolate of the laity, which informs Catholic social doctrine, isn't that a path forward?
I would say my own view is that I agree with what you say about the Catholic Rite, but I think that there were, if not equal, at least egregious moments in the work of the Catholic left or the liberal approach in the last 50 years as well. And this is what I was getting at when I was saying there's only half the story. You know, like in 1976, the Democratic Party put as one of its platforms, one of its planks, abortion rights. And that alienated Catholics from the Democratic Party. They went right. And the people that tell that story say, we did it for good reasons. So we need to have an argument about that, it would seem to me. And you know, with the challenge of peace, a lot of us were really disappointed with that letter because it didn't outrightly condemn nuclear weapons and deterrence policy, and it allowed a kind of escape clauses for that people in the military would just keep doing what they were doing rather than thinking maybe I should leave the military because my duties obligate me to be part of this nuclear system and it could destroy all humanity and so on and so forth. I see that as a failure. Now, I think the right had a role in that. We all know that with Novak and his counterpastoral letter in 1983. But the left had a role in that too by coming out with such a compromised understanding of the morality of nuclear weapons that we were all left not knowing exactly what to do except following Dan Berrigan's, path of protesting and so on. So I get a little impatient with, everyone's against war these days. Where were they 10 years ago? Or 12 years ago? Everyone is worried about child separation now and immigration, but where were they in 2014 when there was family separation at the border? And when Obama was president. And so what I want to say is that both sides have been egregiously wrong. And we have to say a pox on both your houses and then somehow start from the ground up with some serious alternative views. And that's why in that sense I feel like I can say with Dorothy that we need to be in certain restricted sense or certain well-defined sense anarchistic about a lot. It doesn't mean that we disengage entirely from the state and so on and so forth. You can't do that. But it does mean that we can have a different take for it. I'd like to talk to military people and help them get out of the military because our nation fights only unjust wars and has been doing it steadily for this century. the better part of this century. So I don't know. Here's another way to put this. Everyone's talking about how bad it is now with Trump, and I think it's really bad. But you know what? It's been bad a long time. And people have a lot of stake, especially if they lean left, of defining the present moment in contrast to the good old days when what? When Obama and Biden were presiding over the dirty war on terror? I mean, it just seems to me that we have to be careful of the way that we're allowing our political discourse in these cliches to blind us to, one, how bad it's been, and two, how urgently we need to try things new things. I don't know if that, I had too much coffee at lunch.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that, I mean, the thrust of my comment wasn't that the left was bad. It was, there's something that emerged out of the whole tradition of modern Catholic social teaching, which was an incarnational apostolate of the lay apostolate. And that was endorsed by a sacred ecumenical council and shows up in a lot of social encyclicals, and we didn't receive that. So that might be the point. Isn't that a different approach rather than say the left was this bad or the right was that bad?
Yeah, I'm just wary of the notion of incarnation too, because it gets used in such different ways. When I was at Notre Dame, I remember one of the commanders of the Razzi detachment there used the incarnation to justify us plugging in to the world and acting justly. So that's how we have Razzi detachment in Notre Dame. This is just an absolute misuse of the notion of incarnation if it's abstracted from any of the actual teachings of Jesus. And I don't know. It seems to me that we have to be, very careful of words and cliches that cover up as much as they illuminate.
Man, we invited Mike to cheer everybody up.
Yeah.
Yeah. My question is about the state. Leo XIII was wrestling with the consequences of the Risorgimento. And then you had the Roman question. So with the fall of the papal state and the rise in Italian nationalism, that even Catholics were threatened, with communication if they voted in elections. And somehow Leo XIV right now is dealing from the I don't know how to frame it, the question and answer over when he said, "I'm not afraid of the Trump administration," which perhaps is an indication of the way he is leading the church on the question of church and state. So my question is really, are we reaching the end of a certain Western liberal notion of state, going back to John Locke and the social contract theories, because the state today is the greatest source of irrationality, violence, destruction, and we are facing the rise of autocrats. And this is not just an American phenomenon, it's all over. In the Muslim world, you see it in Turkey, you see everywhere in Africa. So have we reached the end of a certain idea? Has the idea of the liberal state, is it exhausted? And Steve, your question of citizens assuming responsibility, which is close to the theology of the people, is that the way? Or is the church? I mean, if we look at how we run our own affairs, I don't know if people looking at the way the church is run, they see an alternate reimagination of the social order. So that's a concern.
Well, that's a pretty small and simple question. Stan. Look, Leo the 13th, as I said before, was compelled to be progressive in some ways because he had to deal with the meaning of the modern national state in a way that the church had been avoiding for centuries, and for a variety of reasons at the end of the 19th century it could no longer avoid. I just contributed a chapter to a book edited by Mark Silk that'll be coming out later this year about religion in Trump's America, and he asked me to write about integralism. I didn't quite know what I was going to write, but I came across something that Joseph Ratzinger had written earlier. I have the citation. I can't summon it to mind right now, but and it was actually something that Alistair McIntyre pointed me toward. That it was a mistake, or that it was a regret that in the 19th century the church had embraced nationalism rather than fraternity. Fraternity was available, but it was a dirty word because it was associated with revolution. And so the church, in its own way, embraced nationalism, not everywhere, but the church embraced nationalism in somewhere like Spain, for example. And there were consequences of that. The church did not embrace nationalisms where it could not work through Catholic citizens. And this, in some ways, comes back to Bill's question. Because of that incarnational spirit of citizens living their faith, that, I think, from a certain point of view of the church of the 19th and 20th centuries, trying to figure out how to navigate a modern constitutional state, the way to do it was no longer through a Catholic head of state. The way to do it was through Catholic citizenship, but to still sustain the same Christendom that had been the goal all along. Stan's question is more directly asking the question, not just for Catholics, but really for all of us, where is all of this going? And my short answer to his question on whether the liberal state is exhausted is yes, and I hope not. But I do think it is. I do think the state as we have it is not up to the challenges that we're facing today. I think the problem is liberalism, and that would be a much longer conversation. But that's also why I often speak in terms of the modern constitutional state rather than speaking in terms of liberalism. We can have a long conversation about why. It is very clear that the state is surrounded on all sides. The liberal state as we have it today is surrounded on all sides by money and power that it cannot control. And the church has that problem too, and we're going to have to imagine a way out of that. I might be getting well beyond the scope of the question, but it was a pretty big question. I think I would just say last to Bill's question earlier, I feel constrained to point out, agreeing that it was a grievous omission not to bring forth what Apostolicam Actuositatem asked for at the Second Vatican Council. It's also the case that Steve Bannon is the people of God. And it's also the case that Peter Thiel is the people of God. And so we have to be very careful to make sure that we are actually formed in those principles and forming people in those principles, or else a lot can go wrong.
Hello, I'm a DePaul student, so a lot less degrees, so I hope this isn't too simple of a question. But back a year ago when Pope Leo was just elected, I heard a lot of people saying that the cardinals selected an American pope very specifically in terms of our global climate. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, and maybe anything we've seen so far from Pope Leo, and maybe what we might see from him in the future.
Well, I was one of those people who said that on the day. And I'll tell you why, although I'm writing something now about how I kind of regret having said it. But I'll tell you why I said it. It was because it reminded me, one of my first thoughts was, it reminded me of the election of John Paul II in 1978. That we're looking at something happening around the globe. The church needs to speak to it. We need someone who understands it from the inside. Right? We need the Polish Pope from behind the Iron Curtain to address this Cold War that we are still in. We're looking at rising authoritarianism. We need an American who speaks the language and understands the politics and understands the social life. I don't think that's the only reason, right? And none of the cardinals has told me. Also, it's very important to say. But I think there is that resonance with the election of Cardinal Wojtyła in 1978. I think it certainly is true that Pope Leo has shown us he does understand the United States. He does understand what's happening here right now. And I think that has a lot to recommend it. It's also filled with some dangers, too, but so far he's been clever enough to avoid them. But I don't think your question's a wrong one. I think that's actually, in a way, what's happening.
I was happy to see Pope Leo get elected. Not that he needed my approval, but I was happy because he was of a certain generation of seminarian and priests who went to Latin America and got to learn about the United States of America from Latin America. And I think we got a taste of this in last evening's, yesterday afternoon's narrative of those years when Romero was assassinated and 4 church women were killed in El Salvador in the same year, 1980. Those were both very dramatic, very dark, but also very encouraging years because the church was really standing up to state power in Latin America in dramatic ways. And I feel that this Pope knows that. And it's part of his story. That's why he's down there in Peru right after his ordination. And I feel like he won't be as fooled as maybe an American Pope, a U.S. American Pope, who didn't do that. So in other words, I like the fact that he went to Latin America and he has a view of the United States from outside of it. And I feel like we'll see great statements from him like that. Like, I loved it when he said, I'm not afraid of Trump. Why should he be afraid of Trump? Or, I just love the bluntness and his serene way that he speaks is great. Anyway.
Maybe I can say just a few words. Coming from outside the U.S., and seeing what is happening in the U.S., I don't want to say some of us feel a certain, I don't want to say schadenfreude. Because many people, when they looked at the history of Africa or some other parts of the world, would think, do we have people there? Why are they not fighting against, corruption or dictatorship and so on and so forth? But it is very curious to us, actually, to see that this is happening in the U.S. And maybe to come back to what Stan raised as a question, are we hitting the end of a certain idea of a liberal state? I'm tempted to say no, because I think this is just a moment of recession in some of the values that have been embedded and embodied, I would say, in the American history. And when I look at the American society, for instance, I know that many of the people around the world would run to the U.S. when things went wrong in their countries, looking for, asylum, for, security and peace. And suddenly it is the opposite. Many Americans actually have been trying to run away from the U.S. and going to Canada. It appears to me that it just embodies some kind of contradiction that we may be living and facing in the history of politics, but it doesn't mean that people have renounced all the values that the U.S. embodied in the past. We still have aspirations to democracy, to the respect for human rights, to all the fundamentals that really make human beings human beings. And this is where I can blend maybe with the last question, the last question, to say that to have a pope who comes from those cultures where poverty and domination and power abuse have been normalized is quite a consolation, and to know that, as San was saying, he's not afraid of Trump. I believe it is also a reminder that it's part of the prophetic mission of the church to stand up to abusive power. And if someone was saying that the church has been dormant or sleeping, maybe it is a call that we need a church that will rise and stand up and say we are not afraid to just speak the truth to the power. So, yeah, thank you.
So we have just 3 minutes left for a very quick question and a very quick answer. Afi, you want to take the list? Sure.
One of the themes that Pope Leo has addressed is around undemocratic governance, and this came out in a couple of his speeches, and of course, this again is tied to corruption and failure of leadership. And I'm just wondering, might we also think about not just a kind of failure, and this comes back to the question of ethics and morality, in a sense in which we might think about not simply the failure of theological imagination, but also the failure of moral imagination, in a way in which it raises new questions, whether the Pope was also thinking about not just corruption in the political terrain, but also corruption in the church. Because corruption in the church smells.
Yeah. Anybody want to react to that, or we just, can I get an amen?
Yeah, right. No, it just occurs to me that what Dorothy Day said, we're all called to be saints. And I think that is true. I think that I fall short, and any saint thinks that he or she fell short too. But I feel that if we look at, say, Catholic social teaching, of course, that this is noted in terms of like exemplars rather than problems, lives to be lived, embodied lives lived, rather than policies to be debated. I feel like we might be able to think our way into a new reality. If we look at people like Franz Jägerstätter or the monks of Algeria or Julia Greeley of Denver, we start to see, I feel, a new path that helps us de-emphasize these great problems of our time by living toward solutions, because the solution really is, again to quote Dorothy, love embodied, and how it looks like, what it looks like in the world. Anyway.
Great. Join me in thanking our guests. That was pretty cordial, wasn't it?